Here we are. So this is a short gauge derailleur for a road bike. It's very similar to the type of derailleur you see on every bike. This particular one is considered a short gauge due to the distance from pulley A to pulley B on the derailleur here. There are long gauges, which you'll see a lot of times on hybrid bikes or mountain bikes. That's just simply because there's a higher gear ratios difference between the rear gear cluster and the front as far as number of teeth. And with that, you need more flex in the chain. And the more flex you have, you'll see the derailleur actually pulls. And that allows that wider range of distance. Not too many tools you need to do this job. Three in particular. A size 4 Allen key, a size 6 Allen key, and then a Phillips head screwdriver, preferably a smaller Phillips head. You can use large, but small works just as well. So what we're going to start by doing is shifting the bike into its easiest gear. That's going to be small in the front, big in the back. We're just going to do that by simply taking the take that derailleur in the rear and push it till it has full tension. And what you'll see then is it shifts into its largest gear. Now the first thing you're going to do with this, now that it's there, is I'm actually going to grab onto the derailleur with the wheel spinning kind of slow and press on it to try to push the derailleur into the wheel. You'll hear that it doesn't actually spin into the wheel. It doesn't make any clicking sounds or anything like that because there is a screw called the low screw, which is this one here. Most are indicated with an L, that prevents it from moving the distance to hit the wheel. If I loosen that screw up, which I'm going to do here, and do that same thing where the wheel spins, you'll actually hear that I can press the derailleur into the spokes of the wheel. Now the issue with that is if I can hit the spokes of the wheel with the derailleur, if the derailleur gets out of adjustment, what can then happen is that can slide its way into the wheel, and that's when you get your derailleur caught in your back wheel, which is a nightmare if you've ever had it happen. It ends up making your ride extremely short. So what I'm going to do is just adjust that back in. You always want to do quarter turn adjustments if it's already fine-tuned and you're just trying to get it a little bit closer, because you don't want to push it too far to the point where when you're riding and the bike is under tension, it doesn't want to go into the easiest gear. So you just kind of play with it until you get it to that point where it's going to shift into its gear, no problem. Next, you're going to set your high limit. So what I'm going to do is just simply release all the tension on the derailleur for the rear. So now there is no, there's actually no tension on this cable here other than it being tight. And you'll notice that when I pluck it, it goes back to its normal spot. It doesn't pling like a guitar string, so it doesn't make really a sound, but it does go back to its neutral spot, which is what you want. Now what we're going to do is simply adjust that. It's actually pretty straightforward the way this works. We're actually going to slide the camera around here so you can see it a little bit easier. Now the way this works is you want to look from the back of the bike forward. Now what you're going to be able to see here is the derailleur, and you'll notice that the chain is right in line with itself, top to bottom, and the way it should be is a little bit to the right of the gear cluster, the derailleur should be. So that high limit screw is going to hold the derailleur there at that high limit so that it won't go off the end into the bike frame. If the chain were to come off and go into the bike frame, it'll gnarl up the frame, paint, metal, as well as can possibly damage the chain, derailleur, all sorts of things. Plus, it can also stop the rotation of the wheel, which the rotation stops, obviously the forward motion stops. And when that happens, it's not a good day for anybody. So that high limit is going to be this other screw here. You screw it in to press it in more, and if you run it out, the derailleur can move outward more. Now, the Allen wrenches, which you saw here and here, are to check two things. One, you always want to be sure that the derailleur itself is on the bike frame tightly. So I'm going to use that size 6 to check that. The reason you want to make sure that that's tight is you don't want vibration to end up making the derailleur come off. If the derailleur does come off, most often it slides its way up the chain, and it doesn't really do damage. However, it does come apart, so that's something you don't want to happen. So now what you're going to do is check the tension of the chain, the tension of the cable. The way that's done is you do go into your hardest gear in the rear, which is your smallest, and then you're just going to look at that cable again. You want to make sure that when you pull it, it snaps back to straight. Also, when you pull it, you can see the derailleur wants to move, and there's no lag time between when I pull and that derailleur moves. That allows me to know that the tension on the cable is tight enough to get it into the proper gears, so that when you're using an indexing shifter, which is where you're going to hear clicks, which I'm going to go ahead and show you. When I click one, the chain moves one. Now you'll notice that it's trying to keep on going, which is where the fine-tune adjustment comes into play. So we don't want it to try to move up to the next gear, and the reason it's trying to do that is there's too much tension on the cable. So when I pulled all the slack out of the cable here with this adjuster nut on the back, I did too much. So this little barrel adjuster is how you fine-tune the rear derailleur. I'm going to simply rotate it clockwise, which tightens it down. And what that tightening does is actually give slack to the cabling, and then allows the derailleur to be looser. So now you'll see when I shift one, it goes one. When I shift back, it goes back down. You'll also, if you listen, you hear a little bit of chatter coming from the front derailleur. That's going to be our next adjustment portion. But really, that's all you need to adjust. It should shift freely up through all the gears without going off on the inside. And as you go down, it should shift down through the gears without issue. And you should be able to go up and down. And the chain should not foul up or fall off. If it does, then you know you have a misadjustment somewhere. You'll notice that for this particular bike, when I'm in the very center, there's not any sound other than the chain running through the pulleys. The chain isn't hitting any of the derailleur cage on the front, as well as it's not touching the edge of the front rings. That's because on bikes, the shifting is designed to be, side specific. So if you're in your easiest gear in the front, you want to remain in the easiest in the back to the center, and then you want to downshift to the easier ones when you shift into the bigger gear, but you want to still stay in the middle of the range. And then when you get in your very hardest gear, that's when you use your upper range gears. The reason that it is that way is they want you to have that ability to shift up and down in the gear range without having a problem with the chain binding or rubbing, as well as it makes your life a little bit easier when it comes down to the shifting on itself. So the next is adjustment of the front gear ratio, which I'm just going to, we're going to slide our way over here. All right. So what we now have here is our front derailleur. Depending on where you're from, you may say derailleur. I say derailleur. Same basic concept. You'll notice two screws, top and bottom. One is labeled H, one is labeled L on most bikes. This stuff on this bike is from quite a few years ago. It's all Shimano 600, which was the predecessor to Shimano Durace. which is the newer shifter that Shimano makes, which is their highest end. This is kind of part of their race equipment, which is what this bike's decked out with. You'll notice one big thing. This derailleur cage is right above the teeth of this gear. Now, depending on your preference, it can be closer or further. If you are using a mountain bike or hybrid, you will see a larger distance between these two. I like them extremely close. It allows for just the bike to not have as much opportunity to get out of sync with itself. And what I mean by that is, if the derailleur's up high, a lot of times you're going to have trouble shifting the gears into the full range easily. So I keep it nice and close, and that just makes my life a little bit easier when it comes to the shifting on the go. Now, one big thing with the front derailleur is it needs to be perfectly parallel. So this cage, if you look vertically on the bike, should be parallel with this gear. If it's not, you need to loosen the adjuster and twist left and right the derailleur until this cage is parallel with this gear. Once that happens, it's going to allow you to adjust the bike properly. If it is directed in a different, so let's say maybe the derailleur's twisted a little bit, what ends up happening is it'll work in some gears, but it'll chatter in a lot of the other ones. So it's imperative that those remain parallel for the best overall workings of the bike. So now, same exact concept. You're going to shift down into your easiest gear and your easiest gear in the back. So we're going to go ahead and get the bike there. Now, for my bike, this is not a gear that I use. So right now the adjustment of the bike is set so that the chain will actually rub on the cage. If you do want to use this gear, you can simply use your low adjuster screw by turning it outward. This allows the derailleur to move inward more on the bike frame and will clear it in regards to the chain. The reason I don't use that is because I use the higher range of the gear mostly. So I don't need that low gear range. I don't live in a very hilly, mountainous area. It's pretty flat out here in South Carolina, so I don't need that low range. Now comes the high ratio. So biggest thing is you want to shift the bike into its high range and then drop the rear down to its easiest. Now, you're going to hear chatter here, which is a sign that the derailleur is not allowing the chain to move out far enough. And we're going to have to adjust the high screw outward, and this gives the derailleur more motion to move outward. Now, one thing to remember so you don't damage the bike and the adjuster screws is release tension from that derailleur. So I'm going to release the tension a little bit. That way I can adjust the screw properly. And I'm just going to go a quarter turn. And you'll hear no more rubbing on the chain, which is what I want. Now you are going to hear a little bit of rubbing as the chain runs through the pulleys. That's just kind of part of the woes of biking. You have a lot of moving, rotating parts, so in regards to that, you're going to hear that rubbing and that rotational sound. But not to fear, it's nothing bad, so I wouldn't worry so much about it. As far as that goes, the last bit that I always like to bring up is the storage of the bike, leaving it overnight or for a week or 2-3 weeks, however long you're not going to ride. You never ever want to leave it in its hardest gear, this big gear here, or in the big gear of the rear. You want to leave it in the middle of the rear gear cluster, and you want to go ahead and drop it down to the easiest gear in the front. What that does is that releases all the tension on the rear derailleur. So you can see here, the derailleur is actually the tension is relieved. So now you don't have to worry about the derailleur stretching out or the cables being pulled on heavily or anything like that. It just gives the bike a little bit more of a relaxed setup, so you don't damage it as the bike sits. So you'll see the tension on the chain is not that much, and the derailleur here has no more. It can't come back into the frame anymore, so it only goes outward more, not inward more. And that design is to just let the tension off the springs in the derailleur, and that just prolongs the life. Now, if you're curious what all this is because I change a lot of my parts out often, so I don't snip the cables and put end caps on. This is just the rest of the cabling. Your bike obviously probably won't have that. That's just something I leave on mine so that I can reuse the cable length if I change from a long cage to a short cage or something like that. I always like to repurpose each bike into something different as different seasons happen, so that's why you might see that. Outside of that, that's really gear adjustment, how to do the front and back. Another good thing to remember is that cables stretch every time you ride. So adjusting from one ride to the next is not something that is abnormal or will never happen. So it's always a good idea to check it. The easiest way to check it again is to shift into the smallest gear here where there's no tension on the derailleur, and then just check that cable tension. You should be able to push it, pull it, and see the derailleur move. And you'll see it actually moves when I press it. You should be able to see that. If you press on it and the derailleur doesn't do anything, a lot of times that can mean that the tension on the cable is a little bit loose. You'll have multiple adjusters on most bikes. Hybrid and mountain bikes will have adjusters on the actual shifters, whereas this bike only has an adjuster here on the rear derailleur. But you're going to see that adjuster here on almost all bikes, with the exception of some Camping YOLO, which might not have adjusters on anywhere but the shifters. So outside of that, that's pretty much shifter derailleur setup. The biggest thing is to remember, if you have indexing shifters, to make sure those gears are right, dead on with the shifting. If they're not, you'll hear a lot of clattering noises, and the gear is going to want to shift between the gear that you're in and the next one. And when the bike does that, it can cause some issues if the bike's trying to shift gears and you're going up a steep hill and you don't want it to shift gears. So it's sometimes better to make sure that adjustment's right before you go out rather than on the fly adjusting, which you can do. But that's it for that. I hope you enjoyed. I hope it helps. If you have any other questions, just feel free to comment and ask. All right. As a side note, these are those pannier bags I was speaking of. I use these for commuting back and forth to and from work when I lived in Washington. So one big thing that you notice is that they do have reflective stripping on them, which is this brightness that you see here. That's just simply to make you a little bit more visible if you are riding around at night. But that's going to kind of be featured all around the ridges as well as the tops and the handles. So outside of that, that's just kind of the basic setup as far as that goes. If you look at the backs of the bags, you'll see a couple of various pieces. This, which is your clasp piece, it's like a little tooth. There will be a bar on the rack that this sits on, and then this clasp bit, actually, the bar runs over it, and then through the other clip, which is how that works, and then you release the button to pull the bag off. This bit here actually slides left and right. It is designed to hold on to the lower arms of the rack itself. So it moves because not every rack is the same. So these bags are meant to be more universal. So that's what that's for. If we go into the bag, you'll see one large section, which is this. Also, there's a small pouch that you can put keys, that sort of thing in. one thing to remember is that all these bags do have adjusters, so that if the bag is too loose, too tight, you can adjust it. On the bottom of the bag, there's actually an opening that includes an extra net so that you can hold jackets, other things like that, extra materials on the bag. That's in the bottom of each bag, and then there's clips already built on for that. When you don't need that, you can just simply stow it away in the bottom and zip it back shut. In the front of the bag, it's just a large front pouch for whatever various items you may be carrying. These bags do hold a ton of groceries. I was able to get a whole week's worth in both bags, as well as, if I had extra stuff, like that netting will actually hold a carton of milk, and you can tie the bags onto the handle up here so that they don't fall out. So lots of variation there. You also have a tiny top pouch, which is this here. This is designed mostly for money or coins. I did take the Metro a lot of times, and I would keep my Metro card in there. That would allow me to quickly get to it, because I don't like to carry a wallet in my pocket, because riding, it would often fall out. Then there's this top pouch, which is the probably coolest part of this bag. In it is a little yellow sack that actually opens up to become a waterproof cover for the bag itself. Now the way this works, just so you know, is that there is a small black hole, which is at the bottom, is what that's designed for. So you just simply take the bag over the top, just like so, and you'll notice it wraps its way around. Now when there's stuff in the bag, this will pull tight most of the time, but right now there's nothing in it, so you'll see that it actually covers the bag top and bottom completely from the elements, so if it does rain, not a big deal. You'll notice one bit that it doesn't cover, which is the back. That's completely okay. There's a hard plastic board inside which protects anything that's actually inside the pannier from, of course, getting wet. Outside of that, that's pretty much all there is to the bag. They're identical, both of them, so they all come with the same features, and they're extremely new, so you shouldn't have any trouble out of them. But they're made by Bontrager. They're called the Interchange, and they're one of the nicer pannier bags made for commuting and that sort of thing. But those are the bags, so you now know how those go together. Hope it helps.